The sand beneath their feet carried the whispers of prophets and kings, of empires that had risen from these very grains only to be scattered again by the winds of conquest. And on this November morning in the year of our Lord 1177, 500 men stood in formation, knowing that the horizon would soon darken, with an army 50 times their number. Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, sat upon his horse despite the disease that had already claimed the feeling in his hands and was slowly turning his face into a mask of corrupted flesh, his eyes still burning with the peculiar intensity that comes to those who understand they must accomplish in mere years what other men might pursue across decades. The Leper King was 16 years old. His affliction had been discovered when he was 9, during a game with other noble boys when he alone did not cry out in pain, as they tested each other's endurance by driving their fingernails into each other's arms, and his tutor Fulcher had watched in growing horror as the young prince smiled, entirely unaware that his skin had been torn. 7 years had passed since that revelation, 7 years during which the most learned physicians from Constantinople to Cairo had examined the heir to the kingdom of Jerusalem and delivered their quiet, damning verdict. 7 years during which Baldwin had transformed himself from a doomed child into something his enemies would learn to fear. The kingdom he ruled existed as a strip of coastal cities and fortified positions carved into the eastern Mediterranean shore. A realm that should not have survived even a season after its founding during the First Crusade. Yet here it persisted nearly 80 years later, a Christian dagger pointed at the heart of Islam, sustained by a complex web of alliances, betrayals, military innovation, and the simple fact that the Muslim world had spent most of those decades locked in its own fratricidal conflicts. That fragile balance was ending. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom the Franks called Saladin, had spent the past decade methodically uniting the scattered sultanates and emirates under his command, absorbing Damascus, then Aleppo, now controlling a vast crescent of territory that wrapped around the Crusader states like the closing fingers of a fist. His army, now approaching from the south, numbered 26,000 men, perhaps more depending on which scouts you believed. A host that included the finest cavalry from Egypt, Syrian lancers who had learned their craft in the endless steppe warfare against the Turks, Bedouin irregulars who knew every hidden well and secret path in this desert, and thousands of infantry whose discipline had been forged in the conquest of Yemen and the pacification of the Upper Nile. Against this force, Baldwin had managed to gather 500 knights and their attendant men-at-arms, because the bulk of his army was hundreds of miles to the north, besieging the castle of Harem in a campaign that had seemed vitally important just weeks ago, but now appeared to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The king had sent desperate messages recalling those forces, but the laws of time and distance are not moved by desperation, and those messages would take days to arrive, and even if the northern army broke their siege immediately upon receiving them, which was far from certain given the complex politics and prideful commanders involved, they could not possibly return in less than 2 weeks. Saladin would reach Jerusalem in 3 days. The mathematics of the situation was simple and absolute, the kind of equation that required no military genius to solve, because 26,000 soldiers could not be stopped by 500 no matter how brave those 500 might be, no matter how expertly they had trained, no matter how righteous they believed their cause. The city walls of Jerusalem were formidable, true enough, thick stone barriers that had been reinforced and expanded multiple times since the Crusaders had first taken the city in the blood-soaked siege of 1099. But those walls required men to defend them, thousands of men, and the garrison that remained in the city numbered perhaps 2,000, if you counted every able-bodied person, including the clergy and merchants who could be pressed into service. Saladin knew all of this. His scouts had reported the departure of the Frankish army to the north, had counted the diminished patrols along the border, had noted the skeleton crews manning the fortifications, and the Sultan had moved with the decisive speed that characterized his greatest campaigns, pulling his army from the Egyptian frontier and driving north along the coast with such velocity that the Crusaders had barely grasped the scope of the invasion before his advance units were already pillaging the countryside around Ascalon. The strategic objective was obvious even to the most junior of Saladin's emirs: take Jerusalem while it lay vulnerable, strike the killing blow against the Crusader kingdom while its sword arm was extended uselessly to the north, and accomplish in one bold campaign what lesser commanders had failed to achieve in 8 decades. The city held significance that transcended military calculation, for Jerusalem was the third holiest site in Islam, the place from which the Prophet had ascended to heaven during his night journey, and its occupation by Christian forces was a wound to Muslim pride that Saladin had sworn to heal. For the Franks, Jerusalem was equally beyond compromise, the very reason their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had crossed half the world, the symbolic and spiritual centre of their entire colonial enterprise in Outre-mer. For what value had a kingdom of Jerusalem if Jerusalem itself were lost? Baldwin understood that his kingdom could survive the loss of castles, could even survive the loss of entire cities. The historical record proved as much, but it could not survive the loss of its capital because such a defeat would shatter the morale of the Christian population, would invite immediate intervention and interference from the powers of Europe, who would declare the local Frankish lords incompetent, would trigger a cascade of defections among the kingdom's Muslim and Christian Arab vassals who would quite reasonably conclude that backing Saladin was the safer choice. Therefore, Jerusalem could not fall. The logical conclusion of this absolute political necessity combined with the impossible military situation was that Saladin's army had to be stopped before it reached the city walls. This was the problem that Baldwin turned over in his mind as he sat upon his horse, his body wrapped in the white silk that hid the worst of his lesions, his face behind a silver mask that the royal artificers had crafted for him, when the disease had progressed beyond what cosmetics could conceal. His council had presented him with the alternatives, speaking in the careful tones men use when delivering news they know their king does not wish to hear. They could abandon Jerusalem, pull back to Tyre, which was nearly impregnable from the sea, and could be supplied indefinitely by the Italian merchant fleets, preserve the army and wait for reinforcements from Europe, a strategy that was militarily sound and politically impossible. They could bar the city gates and hope that Saladin lacked the patience or supplies for a prolonged siege, a hope that rested on assumptions about enemy intentions that recent intelligence suggested were overly optimistic. Or they could march out and meet Saladin in the field, 500 against 26,000, and die heroically while accomplishing nothing except perhaps buying a few additional days for the civilian population to flee or prepare for the inevitable. Baldwin had listened to each option, had asked questions that demonstrated he understood both the tactical details and the broader implications, and then he'd announced his decision with the calm certainty of a man who had long since made peace with his mortality. They would attack. The word had hung in the council chamber like something physical, something that took up space and weight, and for a long moment no one had spoken because they could not quite believe what they had heard. And then Renaud of Châtillon had begun to laugh, a genuine, delighted sound, because Renaud was half mad and entirely without fear, and he appreciated the beautiful absurdity of what his king was proposing. The others had found their voices then, objections and concerns tumbling over each other, and Baldwin had raised one ruined hand to silence them and explained in his quiet, measured way that Saladin's army was not one unified force, but rather a collection of contingents from different regions under different commanders with different loyalties, bound together by respect for Saladin personally and by the expectation of victory and plunder, and that such an army was psychologically unprepared for a sudden aggressive attack, because they were in the mindset of conquerors advancing against a beaten foe, and that if the Frankish forces could strike hard enough and unexpectedly enough at precisely the right moment, they might create sufficient chaos to disrupt the invasion's momentum, perhaps even force a temporary withdrawal, which would buy time for the northern army to return. It was not a good plan. Everyone in that chamber understood this. It was merely the least impossible of the available options, a gamble that relied on factors no commander could control and assumed enemy reactions that might not materialize. But it had one undeniable advantage over the alternatives. It was a plan that did not concede defeat before the first blow had been struck. So they had ridden out from Jerusalem in the pre-dawn darkness, 500 knights and perhaps twice that number in sergeants and men-at-arms, the full available strength of the kingdom's military orders and secular nobility, men who wore the red cross of the Hospitallers and the black and white of the Templars and the heraldic devices of houses that traced their lineage to Charlemagne and beyond. With them came the most sacred relic in the kingdom's possession, the true cross, the actual wood upon which Christ had been crucified, or so it was believed, a fragment that had been discovered by St. Helena 3 centuries earlier and had since survived fires and thefts and wars, encased now in a golden reliquary studded with gems that caught the torchlight as the Bishop of Bethlehem carried it at the column's head. The presence of the relic transformed the expedition from a military manoeuvre into something approaching a crusade in miniature, and the psychological effect on the men was visible in their bearing, the way they sat straighter in their saddles, because they were riding not just as soldiers of a king but as champions of Christendom itself. And if they were to die, they would die in a state of grace with their salvation assured. Baldwin had positioned himself in the centre of the formation despite the protests of his bodyguard, refusing to command from the rear or from some protected position, because he understood that men who were being asked to attempt the impossible needed to see their king sharing their risk, needed the visible proof that the leper boy was not sending them to deaths he himself feared to face. The army moved south along the coastal road, shadowing Saladin's route but remaining far enough inland that the Muslim scouts did not initially perceive them as a threat, because an army of 500 was not a threat. It was barely an inconvenience, a force that could be screened off by a fraction of Saladin's cavalry while the main body continued its advance. The Crusader scouts ranged ahead into the flanks, Turcopoles mostly, local Christians and converted Muslims who fought as light cavalry, and whose knowledge of the terrain and language made them invaluable for gathering intelligence. And it was these scouts who brought word on the 3rd day of March that Saladin's army had divided. The main body was continuing north toward Ramla, but a substantial raiding force, perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 men, had split off to the east toward the fortress of Montgisard, likely intending to secure that position or at least ensure it could not threaten the army's flank as they advanced on Jerusalem. This was the moment, the opportunity that Baldwin had been waiting for, though he had not dared to hope it would actually materialize, because Saladin had made a mistake, not a large mistake. Indeed, it was barely a mistake at all by conventional military logic, because dividing forces to secure objectives and protect flanks was standard practice. But it meant that for a brief window of time there would be a portion of his army separated from the main body, still vastly outnumbering the Crusader force but no longer by odds that made battle completely unthinkable. And more importantly, this separated force would not be expecting an attack, because they believed themselves to be operating in territory that the Franks had already abandoned. Baldwin gave the orders to change course, and the column wheeled east toward Montgisard, moving now with greater urgency because the window of opportunity would close as soon as Saladin realized what was happening, assuming he did not know already, because the desert was full of eyes and the movement of 500 mounted men could not be kept entirely secret. They rode through a landscape that had been fought over since before the Romans, past the ruins of Byzantine watchtowers and older structures whose origins were lost to memory, through olive groves that had been cultivated for 1,000 years and were now burning, the smoke from Saladin's raiders marking their position like a beacon. The land here was the debatable ground between the kingdoms, areas that were theoretically under Crusader control, but in practice belonged to whoever had the strength to hold them at any given moment, and the local population had learned to survive by bending with whichever army happened to be passing through, hiding their valuables and their daughters, and presenting the appropriate face of cooperation or defiance, depending on who was asking. As the Crusaders approached Montgisard, the scouts reported that the Muslim force had dispersed across the countryside in the standard raiding pattern, spreading out to cover more ground and gather more plunder, units of 100 or 200 men ranging across a front of several miles, which was excellent for efficient pillaging but potentially disastrous for coordinated defense if they were suddenly attacked. And here was another gift of fortune, because Saladin's force was not merely separated from the main body but was itself fragmented into smaller contingents that would struggle to support each other if fighting erupted. Baldwin called his commanders together for a final conference, meeting on horseback because there was no time for the formal council he would have preferred, and he laid out his plan with the economy of words that comes from clarity of purpose. They would strike the nearest Muslim contingent with their full force, annihilate it completely before it could send word or receive support, then immediately withdraw before the other contingents could converge on their position. A hit-and-run attack that would damage enemy morale and supplies without exposing the Crusader force to a prolonged engagement it could not win. It was still a desperate gamble, still relied on factors beyond their control, but it was at least grounded in the practical reality of what 500 determined heavy cavalry could accomplish against a dispersed and unprepared enemy. The Templars would form the vanguard, because the Templars always formed the vanguard. It was written into their order's rule and had become almost a point of religious doctrine, and they would hit the enemy line like a lance, punching through whatever initial resistance existed and creating the chaos into which the rest of the Crusader force would pour. The secular knights would follow in the second wave, exploiting the breach the Templars created, and the Hospitallers would guard the flanks and serve as the reserve, ready to plug gaps or cover the withdrawal when the time came. The men-at-arms would remain mounted if possible, adding their weight to the charge, but would be prepared to dismount and fight on foot if the situation required it, though Baldwin hoped it would not come to that because foot combat would slow their withdrawal and allow the other Muslim contingents time to arrive. The Bishop of Bethlehem blessed the army one final time, elevating the true cross so that every man could see it, and the sight of the golden reliquary catching the afternoon sun drew a roar from the assembled Crusaders, a sound that was part war cry and part prayer, the sound of men committing themselves fully to an action from which many would not return. Then they moved forward, first at a walk to preserve the horses' strength, then a trot as they crossed the final ridge and the Muslim encampment came into view below, scattered across the valley floor where Saladin's raiders had stopped for the midday rest, their horses unsaddled and grazing, their arms stacked, cook fires burning, sentries posted but clearly not expecting trouble. Because why would they be? They were the vanguard of an army of 26,000 operating deep in territory their scouts had reported as abandoned by enemy forces. The Crusaders crested the ridge in full view of the camp, 500 mounted men appearing as if materialised from the air, and for a frozen moment both sides simply stared at each other across the 1,000 yards of dusty ground, each trying to process what they were seeing, and then the Templar commander lowered his lance and the front rank of black and white surcoats exploded forward into a gallop, and the moment for thought passed, and there was only action. The sound of 500 heavy cavalry at full gallop is not something that can be adequately described to someone who's not experienced it. It is a physical phenomenon as much as an auditory one, a thunder that you feel in your chest and in the ground beneath your feet, and the Muslim raiders felt it now as they scrambled for their weapons and tried to form some kind of defensive line. But heavy cavalry has one supreme advantage over nearly every other military force when employed correctly, and that is momentum. The sheer kinetic energy of 1,000 pounds of horse and 180 pounds of man and 70 pounds of armour, moving at 20 miles per hour, concentrated into the point of a 12-foot lance, an amount of force that can punch through shield and mail and body and out the other side. And the laws of physics do not care about numerical superiority or tactical brilliance or religious conviction. The Templar line hit the hastily assembled Muslim defence like a mailed fist through pottery, the front rank of defenders simply ceasing to exist as coherent human beings, transformed in an instant into broken bodies tumbling through the dust, and the Crusader charge ploughed forward into the camp itself, lances splintering and being discarded for swords and maces, horses trained for this work trampling anyone who fell beneath their hooves, the Templars killing with the mechanical efficiency of men who had trained for this exact scenario thousands of times, and for whom the chaos of battle had become almost routine. The secular knights poured through the gap in the second wave, spreading left and right to widen the breach, and now the Muslim camp dissolved into complete chaos as men tried to reach their horses or form defensive positions or simply flee, and in the confusion and dust and screaming it became impossible to tell how many attackers there actually were. And this was important because the psychology of a military engagement is often more decisive than the arithmetic, and right now the raiders were experiencing what felt like an ambush by a vastly superior force rather than a desperate attack by an outnumbered opponent. Baldwin had positioned himself with the Hospitaller reserve on a slight rise where he could observe the battle's development, and what he saw confirmed both his hopes and his fears. The initial attack had succeeded beyond reasonable expectation. The Muslim contingent was shattered and fleeing in multiple directions, but the sounds of combat were already drawing the attention of the other raiding parties, and he could see dust clouds to the south and east where enemy cavalry were converging on their position, and the window for withdrawal was closing faster than he had anticipated. He was preparing to signal the retreat when one of his commanders, Balian of Ibelin, came galloping up the rise with news that transformed the entire situation. The banners they had seen in the distance were not additional raiding parties, but the main body of Saladin's army, or a substantial portion of it, which meant the Sultan had somehow learned of the Crusader movement and was bringing his full force to bear. And what had been a calculated raid against an isolated contingent was about to become exactly the kind of suicidal pitched battle that Baldwin had been trying to avoid. The trap had been sprung, but the question that would decide everything was whether it was Saladin's trap or Baldwin's. In the valley below, the Templar Grand Master had recognised the same reality, and was already pulling his forces back into formation, abandoning the pursuit of fleeing raiders in favour of establishing a defensive position, because 500 men could not fight 26,000 in a fluid running battle. Their only hope was to concentrate their strength and make the enemy pay for every yard of ground. The Muslim forces were pouring into the valley from multiple directions now, the morning's separated raiding parties consolidating back into a unified host, and with them came the banners of Saladin's own household guard and the great yellow standard that marked the Sultan's personal position. And Baldwin felt something like relief, because if Saladin was here, then this was not a subsidiary force or a screening element, but the main army, which meant the Sultan had abandoned or at least postponed his advance on Jerusalem to deal with this Crusader force, which meant Baldwin's desperate gambit had already achieved its primary strategic objective, even if every man here died in the next hour. The armies arrayed themselves across the valley floor as armies had done on this same ground during the Wars of the Pharaohs and the campaigns of Alexander and the Roman pacification of Judea, because the logic of terrain has not changed in 3,000 years, and this valley offered one of the few relatively flat and open spaces in a landscape otherwise dominated by hills and ravines. Saladin's forces vastly outnumbered the Crusaders. This was visible even to the common soldiers, but they were also winded from their rapid march and scattered across a broad front and not yet formed into the kind of cohesive battle line that would allow them to bring their full strength to bear simultaneously. And this disorganisation was the only advantage Baldwin possessed, and he intended to exploit it before it disappeared. He rode to the front of his formation, an act that required his attendants to physically support him in the saddle, because the disease had progressed to the point where he could barely grip the reins, and he addressed his army not with a soaring speech about glory and God, because these men were professionals who knew what they faced and did not need to be convinced or inspired, but with simple fact delivered in his ruined voice that somehow carried across the assembled ranks. Jerusalem was 3 days' march behind them. Saladin's army was here instead of there. Every hour they held this ground was an hour the city's defenders could use to prepare, and if they were to die here, then they would die having saved the kingdom, even if the kingdom never knew it. Then he drew his sword, a movement that clearly caused him pain, though his masked face revealed nothing, and he pointed it toward the Muslim lines and said the only other word that mattered: charge. What followed was not a battle in the sense that military historians would later try to catalogue and analyse. With distinct phases and tactical manoeuvres that could be mapped and understood, it was a collision of human beings and horses and metal that lasted approximately 4 hours and defied rational description even by those who survived it. The Crusaders attacked not as a single mass but in waves, the Templars first as always, then the secular knights, then the Hospitallers, each wave striking a different section of the still-forming Muslim line, and the effect was to prevent Saladin's forces from achieving the coordinated defensive posture that their numbers should have made inevitable, because they were constantly responding to a new threat from a new direction before they had finished responding to the previous one. The Muslim cavalry, Saladin's elite Mamluks, and the Syrian cataphracts, who were every bit as heavily armoured and trained as the Frankish knights, fought with discipline and skill, and in any normal engagement they would have absorbed the Crusader charges and ground down the smaller force through sheer attrition, but the ground beneath them had become treacherous in ways that were not immediately apparent, because the November rains had left the valley floor softer than it appeared, and the hooves of thousands of horses were churning it into mud that grabbed at legs and destroyed footing, and the advantage in this kind of terrain went to the side that could maintain momentum and cohesion, which meant the Crusaders, who were attacking with purpose against the Muslims, who were still trying to establish their formation. Baldwin had committed his entire force to the attack, holding back no reserve because there was nothing a reserve could accomplish in this situation, except die slightly later than everyone else. And this meant that if the assault failed, there would be no fallback position and no second chance. They would simply be enveloped and annihilated. But it also meant that every available sword was in the fight, and the Crusaders were hitting with the maximum possible force at every point of contact. The battle churned across the valley floor, formations dissolving into hundreds of individual combats, and in these small personal struggles, the Frankish knights held the advantage because their armour was slightly heavier and their horses slightly larger, and their swords had the weight to shear through mail when swung with sufficient force. But the Muslims had greater numbers and greater endurance, and a much larger pool of fresh troops to rotate into the fighting. And as the afternoon stretched on, it became clear that the mathematics would eventually assert themselves, and the Crusader line would break. It was only a question of when. Saladin himself had positioned his command post on the eastern ridge, and from there he could see the entire scope of the battle. And what he saw troubled him because his army was not winning as quickly or as decisively as it should have been, and the Frankish formation, though battered and compressed, had not yet collapsed, and every additional minute of combat was costing him men and horses he could not afford to lose, because the strategic situation was more complex than the immediate tactical picture suggested, and he knew, though most of his emirs did not, that a large Crusader relief force was marching south from the northern frontier and would arrive in perhaps 10 days, and his entire campaign plan had been predicated on taking Jerusalem before that force could intervene, and every hour spent here in this valley fighting 500 suicidal Franks was an hour not spent advancing on his real objective. He considered pulling back, disengaging and resuming the march to Jerusalem while leaving a screening force to monitor the Crusaders, but he had committed his personal prestige to this battle by bringing his household troops into the fight, and to withdraw now would be interpreted as a defeat, even if it was tactically sensible. And Saladin's hold on his coalition of emirs and sultans was based on the perception of invincibility, and perception could be more important than reality when commanding an army drawn from a dozen different power bases. So he sent in more troops, fresh cavalry from his reserve, and ordered his commanders to press the attack harder, to accept higher casualties if necessary, but to break the Frankish line before sunset, because fighting at night favoured the defenders and would allow the Crusaders to potentially slip away in the darkness. The fresh Muslim cavalry poured into the valley like a flood, and the Crusader formation compressed further under the pressure, contracting from a battle line into something approaching a circle, the classic defensive posture of a force that was surrounded and fighting for survival, and men were falling now in significant numbers, knights whose families had held lands in Outremer for 3 generations dying in the same mud as their sergeants and squires, and the Bishop of Bethlehem, who had carried the true cross into battle, was cut down by a Syrian lancer, though his attendants managed to recover the reliquary before it could be captured. Baldwin had long since stopped trying to maintain his position with the reserves and was simply in the thick of the fighting, swinging his sword with hands that could no longer feel the grip, relying on muscle memory and the assistance of his bodyguards who formed a protective cordon around him, and steered his horse when his own control faltered, and he was laughing, according to those who survived, actually laughing as he killed and nearly died and killed again, because the disease had already condemned him to a death far worse than anything a clean sword stroke could deliver, and there was a kind of freedom in that knowledge. The sun was setting now, the long shadows stretching across the valley floor, and in the peculiar golden light of late afternoon in the Levantine autumn, the battle took on an almost dreamlike quality, the dust clouds catching the sun and glowing like fire, the blood on the ground appearing black in the lengthening shadows, and both armies were exhausted beyond anything they had previously experienced, because 4 hours of continuous combat is far beyond the normal human capacity for sustained violence. Yet neither side could afford to stop, because stopping meant dying. And then the wind changed. It was a physical phenomenon, a meteorological event that would have occurred whether or not there were 20,000 men killing each other in the valley below. But the timing and the effects were so dramatic that both sides would later interpret it as divine intervention. A strong wind from the west, carrying with it the dust that had been churned up by 10,000 horses, driving that dust directly into the faces of the Muslim army, while clearing the air for the Crusaders, and in an instant the visibility conditions reversed, and the Muslims who had been pressing their numerical advantage were suddenly fighting blind, while the Franks could see their targets clearly. Baldwin recognised the moment for what it was, recognised that this was the opportunity that would not come again, and he shouted for one final charge even though his men had nothing left to give, and somehow they found something anyway, some reserve of strength, or perhaps just the understanding that this was the moment when the battle would be decided one way or another, and the Crusader formation shifted from defensive to offensive, pushing outward instead of contracting inward, and the shocked Muslim forces who'd been on the verge of breaking through the Frankish circle suddenly found themselves being driven back. The charge should not have worked. The men who made it were exhausted and wounded and vastly outnumbered, but the psychology of combat is not a rational thing, and the Muslim cavalry had spent 4 hours expecting to break through the Crusader line, and had not done so, and they were tired and frustrated, and now they were blind from the dust. And when the Franks suddenly attacked with renewed vigour at the exact moment when the wind turned against the Muslims, it created a psychological shock that rippled through Saladin's army, a moment of doubt that spread from unit to unit like a contagion. Saladin saw his line waver, saw units beginning to pull back without orders, saw the cohesion of his battle plans starting to dissolve, and he faced the commander's eternal dilemma: reinforce failure and risk compounding the losses, or accept the setback and preserve his army for future operations. He chose preservation, ordering a general withdrawal to regroup and reform on the eastern ridge, a tactically sound decision that his professional soldiers understood and executed properly, but which looked like retreat to the less disciplined elements of his force, and some units interpreted the withdrawal order as permission to flee outright, and suddenly the organised pullback was threatening to become a rout. The Crusaders pursued, not in an organised formation because they no longer had the strength to maintain formation, but as individuals and small groups, chasing down fleeing Muslims and cutting them down from behind, and this phase of the battle, the pursuit and harassment of a retreating enemy, was in some ways more destructive than the main engagement had been, because men who are running cannot defend themselves, and the Frankish knights were now motivated by something approaching frenzy, the realisation that they were not going to die here, that they had somehow survived the impossible, and that realisation released 4 hours of accumulated terror and rage into violence against anyone they could catch. The pursuit continued until darkness made it too dangerous to continue, until the Crusaders were so dispersed and exhausted that they risked being cut off and destroyed piecemeal by any Muslim force that managed to rally, and Baldwin finally managed to recall his men, assembling them at the fortress of Montgisard, which gave the battle its name, counting the survivors and the losses and trying to comprehend what had just occurred. They had started the day with 500 knights and perhaps 1,000 men-at-arms, and they had fought Saladin's army of 26,000 to a standstill and forced its withdrawal, and by any rational analysis this should not have been possible. Yet, it had happened. The evidence was there in the thousands of Muslim dead scattered across the valley, and in the fact that the Crusader army, battered and reduced but still intact, held the field while Saladin's forces had retreated into the darkness. The casualties on both sides were severe but asymmetric. The Crusaders had lost perhaps a quarter of their force, killed or too wounded to continue fighting, a devastating proportion but sustainable because they had started with so few men that each loss was expected and accounted for, while Saladin's army had lost several thousand killed and even more wounded or scattered, numbers that were smaller as a percentage but represented a significant portion of his elite cavalry and had shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded his campaign. More importantly, the psychological damage to Saladin's coalition was immense, because emirs who had joined his banner expecting an easy conquest of a weakened kingdom were now processing the reality that 500 Frankish knights had fought 26,000 Muslim soldiers and won, and whether that victory was due to superior Crusader fighting ability or divine intervention, or simply extraordinary luck, the result was the same. Saladin's army could be beaten, and the campaign to take Jerusalem while the kingdom was divided had failed, and now the Northern Crusader army would be returning, and the strategic window had closed. Saladin himself withdrew further south over the following days, not in panicked flight but in organised stages, pulling back to Egypt to rest and refit his forces, publicly attributing the withdrawal to the need to address administrative matters in Cairo, but privately acknowledging to his closest advisors that the campaign had been a failure. though he characterised it as a temporary setback rather than a decisive defeat. For Baldwin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Montgisard was something more than a victory. It was a validation, proof that the kingdom could survive even under the most desperate circumstances, that leadership and courage and a willingness to risk everything could sometimes overcome impossible odds. And the young Leper King, who had gambled his entire army on a single desperate charge, became in that moment a figure of legend, whispered about in the markets of Damascus and sung about in the halls of Paris. The strategic effects of the battle rippled outward through the complex political landscape of Outremer and the broader Mediterranean world. The Italian merchant republics, who had been quietly hedging their bets and establishing preliminary contacts with Saladin's administration, in anticipation of a Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, now recommitted to their Crusader allies and increased their naval support. The Byzantine emperor, who had been considering an accommodation with Saladin to preserve Byzantine territories in Anatolia, instead opened negotiations for a joint campaign against Muslim positions in Syria. The emirs of northern Syria, who had been preparing to acknowledge Saladin's supremacy, now delayed their submissions and watched to see if the Sultan's power was as absolute as it had appeared. Baldwin himself survived another 8 years after Montgisard, 8 years during which the disease progressively destroyed his body but left his mind intact. 8 years during which he ruled a kingdom that should have collapsed but instead endured through a combination of his own strategic vision and the breathing space that the victory at Montgisard had purchased. He never fought another major battle personally, because by 1179 his condition had deteriorated to the point where he could not sit a horse unassisted, but he continued to direct his kingdom's military campaigns from a litter, making decisions that his commanders executed in the field, maintaining the delicate balance of alliances and military pressure that kept Saladin at bay. Saladin, for his part, never forgot Montgisard, referred to it in his correspondence as a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence, used it as a cautionary tale when training his officers, and made certain that in all his subsequent campaigns against the Crusader, states he never again divided his forces or advanced without proper reconnaissance of enemy positions. When he finally conquered Jerusalem in 1187, 10 years after Montgisard and a year after Baldwin's death, he did so with an army even larger than the one he had commanded at Montgisard, and with a methodical siege that left nothing to chance. And even then the siege took months and cost thousands of lives, because the city that Baldwin had saved now had those extra years of fortification and preparation that Montgisard had bought. The battle itself would be largely forgotten by European historians, overshadowed by the more famous engagements of the Crusades, the taking of Jerusalem in the First Crusade and its recapture by Saladin, and the subsequent campaigns of Richard Lionheart, because Montgisard did not change the ultimate trajectory of the Crusader kingdom, which would eventually contract and fail. But in the moment, in that November of 1177, it changed everything. It was the difference between a kingdom that survived and one that perished. Between a leper king who died knowing he had preserved his realm and one who would have died watching it burn. The veterans of Montgisard carried their memories of that day for the rest of their lives, and in the declining years of the kingdom, when defeats became more common than victories, old men who had fought in the valley would gather and tell the story to younger knights who had not been born when it happened, describing the weight of the charge and the sound of Saladin's army breaking, and the moment when the wind changed and they understood that God, or fate, or simple fortune had given them a chance and they had seized it with both hands and refused to let go.